Do you feel unloved or unwanted or used by the men around you? Well, the Bible has a couple of stories that I'd like to share with you today that have really stood out in my mind as I've been reading this past week. We're going to be going to Genesis, and we're going to start off in Genesis chapter 16. Now, in this passage, it's talking about how Abraham and Sarah were very old, and God had promised them that they were going to have a child. But, Sarah was in her 90s almost. She was in her 80s at this point, and Abraham was in his 90s. And Sarah decided, look, it's clearly not happening. I am too old to get pregnant and to have children. So if Abraham is going to have any children, we're going to have to be a bit creative about this. So her plan was to do a surrogate pregnancy. And so she gave her servant Hagar, who was an Egyptian woman, to sleep with Abraham, and she would have a child by surrogacy through Hagar. Abraham agreed to this. He didn't put up a fight, so that's what happened. But when Hagar found out she was pregnant, her attitude changed. Now, this is not like she's innocent, right? Her attitude changed, and she was no longer behaving like a servant. And Sarah was quite the Karen and didn't like this shift in attitude of her servant, who was bearing supposedly her child. And so she took offense and spoke to Abraham about it. Abraham was like, look, she's your servant, you deal with it. And so Sarah was actually quite mean to Hagar, and Hagar got so sick of it that she ran away. Now, this is where we pick up the story in Genesis chapter 16 and verse 7. Well, in verse 6, so Abraham said to Sarai, indeed your maid is in your hand, do to her as you please. And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence, so she ran away. Verse 7, now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, and this angel is actually very likely to be Jesus showing up and talking to this slave, this servant woman who's pregnant. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. And the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Now we jump forward a little way, and we are going to go to the point where Isaac is born. So we're going to jump into Genesis chapter 21, verse 8. So Isaac has just been born. So the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham. So now the Egyptian woman, Hagar, her son is now about 14 years old, okay? So she saw Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had born to... Hold on. So Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had born to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said to Abraham... So now, Remember that Hagar had a bit of an attitude when she was pregnant? Well, it turns out that her son has now got that same attitude, okay? Therefore, Sarah said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, she's your wife, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot, for she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Now, the point I want to make with this story about Hagar and her son, especially in that first part in chapter 16, she calls God, you are the God who sees. For she said, have I also seen him who sees me? Now, you would think from the story that Hagar is, at first glance, you'd think that Hagar is the bad guy here, right? Hagar doesn't get a really good rap. But if you think about it more deeply, Hagar was a slave, right? She was given away by the Egyptians, and back in these times, slavery was a very normal part of the economy. It wasn't, such a terrible, horrible thing, although it could be terrible and horrible, especially when things happen like the way that Sarah treated her, right? So Hagar was mistreated by her employer. You could say she was basically an employee-employer relationship. And Sarah abused her in that relationship, and so she ran away, and she went, into the wilderness. There wasn't any way for her to survive, but God spoke to her. God saw her, even though she had been used and passed around between Sarah and Abraham, and she may not have agreed to this situation or consented, but she had been used. She had been used as a commodity, really, or as a service to provide to Abraham and Sarah a child. And when that didn't go the way that Sarah particularly wanted it to, where the respect was broken down, where Hagar began to have an attitude, sure, that wasn't a good thing to do, but it probably didn't warrant such terrible treatment from Sarah that she would run away. So even though Hagar has got a bit of an attitude, and Hagar is sort of seen as the bad guy here, and traditionally we see Hagar and Ishmael as rivals to Isaac and to the promise that God has for this special lineage of the people of God. God even speaks to Hagar and has a promise for Ishmael, for that people group that would come out of them, and very much sees this abused and overlooked woman, right? And he makes a promise to her, and gives her hope and gives her a future, and reminds her of that down the track, and saves her life and speaks to her multiple times. It's really interesting to me that that this story is in the Bible, and of course it is, because that's the kind of God that we have, right? That speaks to us even if nobody else sees our value or our worth and just sees us for what we can provide for people. But God doesn't see us that way. He sees us all as equal, and He loves us all as individuals, and He has a plan and a purpose for each one of us. Even if, because Hagar was an Egyptian, she may not have even necessarily believed in this God of Abraham, right? She might have been serving idols or nothing at all, potentially. Maybe she was a servant of the God of Abraham, but maybe not. But He spoke to her anyway, and he very specially singled her out and showed up for her when she thought she was completely alone. So I really want that to be an encouragement for you. But let's move on to the next story. Actually, the next story will be in part 2. I'll post this and then I'll post the next one.